part 2 for how to paint this Ork Beastboss. So hopefully you watched the first video, and we're just going to be carrying on, finishing off the model now. Starting with the big chopper sword weapon thing. And I'm using Rhinox hide, and the surface of the sword is going to be very rusty to give it a different kind of surface texture and look to the rest of the armor on the model, because again it's going to be painted in non-metallic metal. But the thing is that if you just paint everything the same way, it looks really boring. I'm going to be using the same colors still, so it's apart from the Rhinox hide, but I'm going to be using Mournfang brown, dark sea grey, pale grey blue, white obviously, and some Trollslayer orange. So it's, you can achieve very different looks using the same colors. But just to start with, as I said, so I'm starting off differently with Rhinox hide. The Rhinox hide doesn't make a huge difference. It's basically just to get the flat of the blade a bit darker. It does start the process, and if you look at the marks that I'm making, they're very kind of scribbly and scratchy. Again, very similar to how I painted the armor. But if you don't have a Rhinox hide or whatever, it doesn't really matter too much. You can even do this stage with black if you wanted, but just the color won't quite work as well. You could mix some of the Mournfang brown with black, and that'll give you a very close approximation to the Rhinox hide as well. You can see the marks I'm making. It's kind of like a combination of scratchy, stippling, all sorts of things like that. Don't worry too much about getting completely opaque finish. Don't worry about missing parts. All those kind of things add to the overall look at the end. Just try and make sure you get like a roughly brown looking sword at the end. Don't bother painting also the cutting edge at the bottom, because that's going to be painted slightly differently to separate it out from the flat of the blade. It might actually be worth using a larger brush for this section as well, because you really don't need to spend that much time on it. And there's that little nub at the top there as well. You could, if you wanted, paint that also as a cutting edge. It's entirely up to you. There is going to be some scratches and things painted on top of it, so don't worry too much about any mistakes you make. It can all be covered over with weathering later on. And you can see there that I have left some sections where it looks a little bit grey in patches. Those will be highlighted up, so they'll be kind of like the scratchy areas. But also just having like tiny little sections of stippling, so some of the grey shows through a little bit. Again, it just adds to that sort of texture look of the rust that's going to be there. So now it's Mournfang brown. If you look at my wet palette, it looks a little bit disgusting at the moment in terms of a lot of the paints have started drying out. I've been using this over a few days, and I forget to put the top back on, so it does start to dry out a little bit. Because of the type of painting that I'm doing on the flat of the blade here, having slightly thicker paints doesn't matter too much. In fact, it also, if you have the paint a little bit too thick even, it can add to the texture effect. Because you will get a slight three-dimensional surface texture on the model from having thick paint. You can also achieve the same thing by using texture paints, so you can make your own. You can mix in things like baking soda. I've done that before for rusty blades. That gives a very kind of strong texture build-up though, so you have to be a bit careful doing that. But if you check out some of my guides and things, some of my earlier ones on Patreon or my website, I've painted Nurgle models where I've used baking soda mixed with kind of varnish and paint and things like that, and it does give a really, really nice textured effect. It's pretty suitable for this scale of painting for the texture size. I think Games Workshop do texture paints as well. They don't give quite the same result. It's a bit more subtle, but again, it really depends on the look that you're going for. You can do all sorts of different things, like with weathering powder and things as well. But I'm just trying to keep it very quick and simple for this. So it's just a few colours with stippling, and it does give a pretty reasonable effect, I think. So, as I said, it's just Mournfang brown, kind of stippling it on. It does take a while, the stippling process, so if you get a bit bored, I would recommend just kind of like slapping the paint down really quickly with a slightly larger brush, kind of like bigger blobs. And then once you've got like the area roughly covered, then you can go back with the smaller paintbrush like I'm doing here, and then so it's like refining the stippling. So if you're not careful, you will get some quite large dots on there, but you can start adding lots of small dots all around it, and it'll kind of blend in. So it will definitely speed the process up just to do it that way, and you'll get a pretty good result as well. Just be a little bit careful when you're doing this, because, so as I said, it takes a while. You can get a bit bored doing it if you want to get it done quickly. If you kind of do all the dots, holding the brush in the same position, holding the model in the same position, there is a strong chance that you'll push a little bit hard, and what you end up with is like lots of little dashes rather than dots. So it looks like there's lots of lines all over the brush, all over the sword. Now, if you do that, you can counteract it by just rotating the model and doing the same thing, and it ends up kind of like little cross-hatching marks everywhere. But then if you just take your time a little bit around, again, using some more like finely placed dots with the stippling with the smaller brush, it will also kind of camouflage any mistakes like that. Try not to make it look like a pattern overall, so don't make it all the dots spaced evenly. Some areas you can really pack them in tightly, other areas spread it out a bit, all kinds of things like that. It just helps to give a variation to the texture. And the final level of texture is Trollslayer Orange. Trollslayer Orange is a slightly translucent paint, so I have had other pots of it where it's a bit harder to work with for kind of doing stippling and things like that, because it just doesn't make a very hard mark. Again, like my paint's dried up a bit here, so it'll make, the marks are fine that it's making. But if you find that the Trollslayer Orange is a bit too translucent, a bit too runny, then you can use Fire Dragon Bright as well. It's very close. It's a little bit lighter. It's got more white pigment in it, but it does give a much stronger mark. Here you can see actually my paint was a bit too thick, so I've watered it down a bit there. But it is something to always keep in mind while you're painting. Even if you're using a wet palette, if you leave the top off for a long time, if it's particularly warm when you're doing it as well, or if you have a fan blowing or anything like that, the paint will still dry out. It just means it takes longer to do it with a wet palette. So for example, if you had a dry palette or like a tile painting or something like that, and you had all these colours spaced out like I have on the wet palette there, then they would all dry very, very quickly, and you wouldn't be able to swap between the colours like I do on mine. So there is a strong benefit to using the wet palette, but just remember that the paints don't stay indefinitely wet just sitting there. You do have to keep an eye on them and keep working with them, sometimes adding bits drops of water and things like that, but it does depend like on the environment that you're painting in. On kind of like cold environments, the paint will last a lot longer. I tend to change my paint colours every day anyway, even though I am using a wet palette, because I find that after adding water to them a few times, the properties of the paint change a little bit and you get different marks. So fresh paint gives really strong clean marks. It's very easy to work with for the paint. Once it dries out a bit, then you keep adding more water. Once you've done that 2 or 3 times, the paint sort of breaks down a bit. You can still use it for glazes or very translucent layers, but for stronger, cleaner marks, then you're much better just putting down some fresh paint for it. Back to what I'm doing on the screen there, you can see, so I'm using the Trollslayer Orange still. I'm not covering the whole of the flat of the blade. It's best if you don't do that, because that will just make it look all very consistent. Just pick a few areas. So I've got like on the top like hook area, and then a few more patches here and there where I've done concentrated dots of the Trollslayer Orange, and that'll do. Don't cover the whole flat of the blade. The nice thing about that is it makes it obviously quicker to paint as well. So now we're going to paint in the scratches and the cutting edge of the blade. This is pretty straightforward and simple to do. It's very similar actually to how I painted the steel, the rusty steel effect. So, but I just wanted to show you this anyway, because especially for the cutting edge of the blade, if you do all like these parallel lines, so in this case they're vertical, but they will curve around, so they follow the shape of the blade really. But you know, just doing these very, very simple lines using just the tip of the brush, it gives a very different look to the surface. So again, I'm going to be using this. I've used the same colours on the armour, on the flat of the blade, and it's going to be on the cutting edge of the blade. And all three surfaces will look different, even though they're the same colours. You can see there how I've made the lines just curve around following that shape. It kind of emphasises the curve of the blade there by doing that, and it also allows me, as I highlight it up, to have a very strong highlight in the middle for a kind of a bling effect that you'll see as it goes along. I'm also here putting a little line separating the cutting edge from the flat of the blade. It just helps to define it really, and also allows me to pull out the that scratch, so it's a really heavy sculpted in cut into the blade really, and I can pull that out onto the flat of the blade, so that's not sculpted on, but it just makes it look a little bit like more battle worn and you know, more interesting because it's crossing over between the two surfaces. And then, you know, just painting around the edges. The edging is very, very simple. You leave it broken up in places as well. You don't have to get like a really perfect, you know, unbroken line, and it can be a little bit blobby in places. Put a few lines coming out of it as well. It all looks more realistic and just effective if you have this sort of kind of very rough look to it. So it's nice because it's easier to paint it like that, and it just looks more effective as well. Now, if you wanted for the curved blade, you could actually just spend a lot longer painting it. Now, I'm not painting this to you know, display standard or anything like that, so I didn't want to spend a massive amount of time on all these sections. So all the styles of painting that I'm using, they're very rough and quick, but they could all be refined to a much higher standard if I wanted. And that's the nice thing about this style of painting, is that it looks really effective from a distance. It's a lot more fun to do as well, because it's just more expressive. You don't have to worry so much about mistakes, and you know, you get a strong, high contrast, interesting looking result. And then, so if you wanted, then you can then make it super refined and still keep all of that kind of base work that you've done on there. But so I was saying, like, you know, if you want to, you can spend longer on the cutting edge of the blade, because it is kind of an interesting part. It does separate it out from the rusty surface, and just to do that, it'd just be a case of doing lots and lots of layers of those little lines, keeping them the paint quite thin. You'd probably have to thin it down a bit more than I have here. Mine's kind of 50-50, probably closer to 60-40 water to paint. You know, but if you just wanted it a smoother finish, cleaner, so thinner paint, and just keep going over it more, and then you probably have to do a few glazes at the end. I'm not really bothered about glazes on this model at this stage, but things like, you know, micro glazing, just glazing in general, would definitely clean up and make it look a lot neater all over. Then just the finishing touches here to these edges. These make a big difference. So I'm using pale grey blue and also white for the final little dots. You don't put too much of these colours down. Less is more, definitely. The more of this you put down, the less shiny it actually looks. So if you just do little small dots of pale grey blue and white, it means that they stand out really strongly in the dark environment. Whereas if you put more down, then it actually it kind of swamps the area and it doesn't look like it stands out as much. can see there the right where the curve is on the hook, that's where I'm putting the brightest part of this highlight. You don't have to actually put it there. There's no realistic reason why I've put it like that. It just stands out nicely because I'm trying to make it sort of light next to dark, high contrast. There's a lot of parts in this model actually where I've not been too concerned with the realism level, and I've just gone really high contrast, light next to dark. It just makes things stand out a lot more. You can see that a bit actually on the bronzy kind of clip-on parts on the blade surface there as well. So you can see they don't match the lighting so much on the model. It's just a case of having light next to dark and a little bit of a transition, but they still work quite well, and they're not completely wrong, but they're just a little bit brighter and more, stand out a bit more than they would like naturally if you had an orc standing there in the light with the light coming down from the top left. They probably wouldn't really catch much light at all, whereas obviously for a gaming piece you probably want, like I've done here, just to push the high contrast on a few areas just so they're more visible. You can as well, if you wanted it, to push the complexity of the painting a bit more. You can do multiple shines on this. So I've just really put one. There's a little bit more maybe towards the tip, but generally speaking, it's just this one little shine point. But for things like this, you could do multiple shiny reflections in there. It just makes it look a bit more interesting. But again, it just depends on how much time you want to spend on the model. Then just a few white dots. The final white dots you can actually blob the paint on, so that the line and the mark that you make is a bit bigger than the grey marks underneath it, and that'll give the impression again that it's a little glare. So it's when the shine on metal, it obviously will go out past the edges of the object itself, and so it just helps to trick your eyes into thinking that it's a shiny edge. It might also be interesting as well to add a little bit of colour, maybe some bounce highlights, whatever colour the battlefield terrain would be, into these downwards facing cutting edge parts on the blade. I didn't bother because again I was doing it quicker, but you could have some even green reflections if you've got a green battlefield, which would also be kind of nice because then it would contrast with the orangey reddy browny parts of the blade as well. So now we're on to the horns. The horns and the fur actually are painted very, very similar because I use the same colours on them again. And that's something that I do quite often when I'm trying to get things done quickly, is I will repeat colours over and over. But just because I'm using the same colours doesn't mean to say you can't get a different surface texture or different light volumes and things like that. So you can definitely separate things out on the model just using simple colours. And actually, if you've seen one of the models I painted, is a Slaanesh Chaos Warrior from the Underworlds box set. I just painted it all in black and white, but because I wanted to show that all the surface, so the light volumes and the textures and things will separate all the materials on the model. So you don't have to worry so much about the colours, because as long as you get the light volumes and textures right, things still look like they are. So there's leather and metal and all different things like that. For the colours I'm using here, so it's Morghast Bone and Screaming Skull. The one in the top left, that's just a little bit of black mixed in with the Morghast Bone. You could also mix in Rhinox Hide. It doesn't matter too much as long as it's darker. You could also, I think, some like Baneblade is a very similar kind of colour. But if you've got Morghast Bone and mix a bit of black or brown in with it, you'll get close enough. The only thing that's important is that the colour is slightly lighter than the base colour that's already on there. Now the base colour, remember, was a zenithal highlight on top of black that was then covered with Skeleton Horde contrast paint. So whatever kind of creamy browny colour that you put on there, just make sure that it's slightly lighter than that. And the other thing to remember is as well, so you're not covering the whole of this horn, and this will be the same for all the horns on the model. You're just doing 2/3 that covers from the base of the horn going up towards the tip, stopping before you get to the tip, and then the tip will be left dark. The tip is darker because it wasn't caught as strongly when the zenithal highlight was first put on there. But it doesn't matter if you did catch it, because all you have to do is glaze on some Rhinox hide and some Abaddon black at the end. I don't do that on this model, but I have done it on previous models, and it works fine. But I do actually do it on the fur as well, so you'll see a little bit later in the video, for a very similar colour, how to darken it on the tip. I've also painted these teeth that are tacked onto the horn the same way here, obviously. It probably would have looked better if I painted them separately, but again, I just was rushing through it. I'd probably recommend to paint these lighter, like a lighter colour. So don't actually go for the mix of Morghast bone and black. Instead, I would just start off with maybe Balor brown, and then highlight up from that. I said I mixed black in that. I can't remember now, actually. It might have been that I just mixed Rhinox hide. It doesn't matter too much. Like, the result will be very, very similar. It's a desaturated brown colour, but it's one of those anyway. So maybe test it before you put it on the model. Also, for the position of the highlights, remember that it's a top left-hand side light source for this. So the part that you can see me painting quite strongly here, that's where the light's directly hitting it. Then I don't paint all the way around underneath and all the way around to the right hand side. On the right hand side there'll be a gap where I leave it where it stays dark, but then as it goes further round, then I use that as a bounce highlight. So then I use this colour again, the mix of Rhinox hide and Morghast bone, and do the same thing that I'm doing here, but on the right hand side. But I don't take the highlights any higher than that. Whereas this one, obviously I'm now going up to just plain Morghast bone, and also it will finally go up to Screaming Skull. So don't do that on the right hand side. That stays as a bounce highlight, whereas on this left hand side, this upper left hand side, this gets highlighted all the way up. And I think you'll see in the photographs anyway at the end, it does create quite a strong three-dimensional look to this. And also it makes it look a little bit shiny as well. And you can see the marks that I'm making, just keep going over and over the lines. The first few marks that you do with the base layer highlights, they can be quite thick and chunky and rough, and then as you get higher and brighter, just be a little bit more refined, a bit neater with the placement of the highlights, and it kind of like all blends together and then looks neater at the same time. Also, not forgetting that you don't want to cover the entirety of the first highlights that you put down. So remember, you put the first highlights down, they're big and chunky, cover a large area. Then every time you get a brighter highlight, so going up to Morghast bone and then Screaming Skull, you'll make each highlight area smaller, so the previous highlight area is still visible underneath at the edges, because then that works as a transition. Whereas if you just kind of layer them on top, unless you're working with the translucency of the paint, with layering on top for very large light volumes, you're basically wasting your time because you're just covering over work that you've already done. So again, I'm using a thin brush. This is a size 00 Artist Opus brush for the final kind of highlight, just to neaten it up. But it's still not super neat. Try and just keep moving with this style of painting. Don't worry too much about mistakes and things. It looks very orky to have all these scratches and dents everywhere. And if you just go a little bit off with one of the lines, it's not the end of the world, and it can kind of blend into the painting anyway. And you can see here the highlights, as they get further and further, higher up with the brightness, they're getting closer and closer to the very base of the horn. That creates the contrast where the tip of the horn is very dark and then the base of the horn is light. And the nice thing about that is then it kind of separates it out. You can see like how the horn connects to the armor, whereas if you had it the other way around, where it was light at the tip and dark at the base, it would kind of fade into the darkness of the model where it connects. So now I'm going to be painting a little bit on the face. This isn't going to be the finished face because I actually saved that to the end. So if you want to see how the face finishes, you have to skip to the end of the video. But I did start at this point blocking it in, but then I kind of changed my mind as I was going along. It's very simple, the color highlight stages that I'm going through. So obviously, again, it's a zenithal prime over a black primer. Then it had Ork hide with some contrast medium mixed in to thin it a little bit. So that was given a coat on the Ork head. Now I'm using Warboss green, and first thing you're going to notice as you start applying this is, well, Warboss green doesn't have great coverage. So you're probably going to have to do quite a few layers just to get the opacity that you want. But what it will do is kind of knock back the shine straight away that's left over from the contrast paints. But what I actually do as well is I give the model a quick varnish halfway through painting it. So I'm using Ultramatte Lucky Varnish. It just takes away a lot of the shine. So that I can see more clearly what I'm painting. So one of the nice things about a shiny model, shiny surface while you're painting is it's very easy to hold it under the lamp and see how the light reflects off of it for your light volumes and light placement and things. But it also makes it quite hard to actually see what you're doing when you look at the model, because it glares at you. So I like to give it a quick matte coat. It just knocks it back so I can see exactly what I'm doing with the brush. And as I said, I'm using Warboss green. It's pretty simple. You can see the raised edges. Anything that's really kind of light coloured, that's the area that you want to be going over with this. It is worth spending more time on the head of the model. It is the area that most people will look at straight away when they pick up a model. But one of the things that I like to do when painting just things in general is add more detail than is already there. So you can already see that with all the texture marks and things and scratches that are painted over the Ork. But on the face, I will be doing the same sort of thing. So the face is going to stop there for the time being, pretty much. I'm going to tell a lie. I'm going to do one more stage of highlight. So all I've done is added some Screaming Skull. You can see on the wet palette there's 3 green colours, and it's just it's Ork. Warboss green. Then I've just added Screaming Skull in 2 stages to those other highlights, but I'm not actually going to get very far at this stage, but it will block in the highlights. And as I said, you can add extra textures on there. So you see, particularly if you look at the temple on the model, it's quite a plain area, but he's got these details around the eye and things. So I just kind of extend those out, and it makes it look a little bit more interesting. Makes him a bit meaner looking as well, I think. But we will come back to those at the end of the video. And there's one very good reason for it as well. As I'm going along here, you can see I'm painting in these areas, and I'm just picking out the highlighted points. But the problem is, because of the light direction coming from the top left, there's actually too many dark recesses on here, so it doesn't match the light source. And I want the head to stand out a bit more anyway. So what I'll end up doing will be some of the detail that I'll add will go straight over the darker areas, so it just kind of brings it up, makes it lighter, makes it more of a focal point. The brightest areas on the face, though, should really be around the eyes and the forehead. And always, when you're painting these highlights on, always keep in mind that the light's coming from the top left. It's easy to get to miss that a little bit. You are obviously guided by the zenithal highlight, and then with the contrast over the top. But remember, the whole head is still green, because they covered the whole head with the Ork flesh, whatever it is, the Ork green contrast color. So you sometimes can forget a little bit that you want to keep the light source coming from the top left there. So now we're going to go back to the fur. I already mentioned this is painted the same way as the horns. It's not just in terms of the colour as well. So the colours are the same. So it's got that Rhinox hide mixed with Morghast bone to start with. It's a little bit strange, actually. So if you look at it on the wet palette there, it looks like quite a dark brown, but it's not. I don't know why it appears so dark when it's on the wet palette, and that's not to do with the camera or anything. That's how it looks on my wet palette. But when you take the paint from them, apply it to the model, it becomes much, much lighter. And it's only a very tiny amount of Rhinox hide that's mixed in with the Morghast bone to make it darker. So it's actually quite close to Morghast bone. It's just, for some reason, having that darker colour in there makes a big visual impact when it's on the wet palette. But you can already see one side of the fur's been painted on. And it's very simple again. You're painting towards the base. So exactly, again, same way as the horns. Where the fur, connects to the skin, I guess, of the fur pelt. Then you're painting that as the lighter part, and then you will layer up. Obviously I took the head off. I think I mentioned in the first video, the head was just blue tacked on, so I could take it off at any point to give me easy access. It's the only part of the model that isn't glued together, but you can see that the model does have a tongue. And it's quite hard to reach inside the mouth with a paintbrush to paint it. So I planned ahead for that. I usually forget these kind of things and just glue it all together. But now it's just a little bit easier as well to paint the fur, because the head isn't getting in the way, particularly that lower jaw. It's quite large. And so as already mentioned, so you're going through the same process, layering up the mix of Morghast bone and Rhinox hide, then pure Morghast bone, and then finally at the very base of the fur, Screaming Skull. If you go a little bit wrong, it doesn't matter too much, but it does help a bit if you can keep these more blended than the horn. The horn is more textured, obviously, so you can go more wrong with that with the paintbrush kind of scuffy marks, whereas the fur tufts, they work a little bit better, looking smoother. But if you just go a little bit too strong with the highlights, don't worry, because we are going to do a little bit of glazing on the tip of them. You can see the tips, they kind of look kind of messy on the left hand side. We're going to wipe out all of that very quickly and easily. In fact, I've already started it there. I just let the video actually catch up to what I'm talking about. So here, this is Screaming Skull still. What this is doing is increasing the tonal contrast. It's also helping the brightness of this part of the model. It's a little bit tricky with how I've done it to make the head stand out as a focal point. I do take the highlights on the head very high, but even then, just because of the colour of the fur around it, it's very close in to the head. The highlights on the skin, it makes it a little bit harder to make the skin stand out. I don't actually mind that too much. The whole area is fairly bright, so it stands out as a focal point as a whole area. But if you just wanted the head on its own to stand out, you have to make the fur around it darker. And I just, I prefer painting it like this. So now the video is caught up to what I was talking about, painting the tips of the fur. Now this is watered down quite a lot. You want this around 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part paint. It's kind of like a heavy glaze. I'm also using a larger brush now. I've gone up to a size 1, just because I find glazing is generally a little bit easier with a larger brush. You can keep going longer. But when you're applying this, always start kind of a third of the way down on the tufts of fur, and then paint up towards the tip. Don't do it the other way around, because then you'll end up with a big blob of paint right in the middle. Whereas if you paint towards the tip, it'll actually work like a transition, so it gets darker towards the tip. And then all this fur at the back, basically you can only see the tips of all these tufts as you go back, so just cover the whole area with the Rhinox hide. And it will work quite nicely. It does help a little bit then as well with the focal point, because you are getting that dark area in there. Do try and do some of the tips on the fur around, the lower down tufts. They will, it does look nicer having a few of them, but be careful doing it, because you don't want to waste. Because if you go over too much of the what you've already painted, it just makes it dark, and you've wasted your time. But if you just feel that you've taken the Rhinox hide a little bit too low down, don't forget you've still got your wet palette with the Morghast bone and the mix with the Rhinox hide as well, and you can just go over it, the transition area slightly, and it'll all blend in together anyway. Also for the fur, as it kind of goes down underneath where the head will be, you can paint that a bit darker as well. Then the final stage is just to take it up to black. Again, make sure this is watered down quite a bit. 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part paint. Test it in case you aren't sure. Depending on the black you use. So if you're using Vallejo model color black, that has it's quite a an opaque paint. So you might need to water that one down more. Because if you don't, it will just make a very strong black mark. And you don't want that. You want it to be like a soft black mark so it transitions in. There you can see it now. So I just basically covered that whole area and stuck the head back on. You can see how it all works there now. At the same time, now the head's back on, just very quickly covering the teeth in Balor Brown. Slightly out of focus, but I think you can get the idea. You see what I mean now as well, how it would be quite tricky to paint the tongue. I did actually go back and kind of highlight it up a bit neater than what you saw when the head was off. Also, while you're doing the Balor Brown, paint in these little kind of bone hair bubbles, hair clasps, whatever they are. I wasn't entirely sure what they were, so I had to reference Games Workshop's box art for this. And it looked like, I think they're probably supposed to be sections of a spine. So painting them bone seems to be the right way to do it. For some reason, the one that's connecting the hair to the head, it's got these 2 extra little bobbly bits on. And when I looked at the Games Workshop artwork, they'd painted those as blue gems. So I did the same. I don't know what they're supposed to be, but later on in the video, you see that they just suddenly appear painted blue gems. I think they actually work quite nicely on it, and they do contrast against the red hair. So if it's something that you like the look of, then it might be worth doing. The bone effect here, again using kind of scratchy, scuffy texture marks. You can do it with stippling, and you kind of like just build up the layers. Don't spend a lot of time on it. They're not very interesting parts of the model, but again, worth putting in there just to get the clarity and the separation out between the different bands of hair. And the other nice thing is as well, because they're painted with different colours, they've got one different colour, the Balor Brown. Because of that, it looks quite different compared to the horns on the fur as well around them. So they do stand out a little bit more yellowy looking. Because I couldn't quite figure out the shapes and things of them, the stippling and scratchy technique works a bit better on that, because it sort of hides the shape a little bit. So you can see I'd already got some paint on there, starting with Mephiston Red, going through to Evil Sunz Scarlet, and then I've mixed in some white with it, basically. So you can see there's Mephiston Red, and then below that is some Evil Sunz Scarlet mixed with white, and then to the right of that is Evil Sunz Scarlet. You can see that they'd started to dry out a little bit as well. So the red that's already on there, that was I think I can't remember. I think I mentioned it in the previous video when I put the contrast paint on. It's either Blood Angel Red or Flesh. I think it's Fleshed Hair is red. It's one of those anyway. So go and check the other video. But that's obviously quite dark looking on this, because again the zenithal highlight over a black primer. So the thing with the zenithal highlight is that you're not doing a solid opaque white or very light color over it, because it's going over black. It basically gives a grey color, and it also has a bit of transition. So upper part, the upper curve on these bits of hair, they'll obviously be a lot lighter. Then it curves around, it goes darker, and you're just emphasizing that now. So the highlighting position again has already been sort of worked out for you. So here's the Evil Sunz Scarlet. Over the top, it's a little bit brighter. It also has a very slight pinky color to it. If you want, you can leave it there at this color if you prefer the really saturated red. I take it a little bit higher than this by adding the white, just to try and make it match a bit more with the actual light on the model. So I already mentioned the skin's going to be quite light, and you can already see the highlights on the horn and the claw and the armor. They all go up quite strong in the light direction. So I tried to make the fur match that, the red fur match that a little bit. But just be careful when you do apply it, because it does make it go pink. And obviously the more that you add, the more pink it'll go. But if you find it just looks too pink for you, just go back with the Evil Sunz Scarlet, kind of just blend it in at the edges a little bit. Also, because I've watered it down now, it's a bit more translucent, so it's not making a very strong opaque mark. It's allowing the other red to show through a bit. You should have noticed as well when I first started applying the highlights that I kept using these vertical marks, but I didn't separate the strands of hair out too much. It's not until this final highlight really that I'm now picking out the strands of highlight, the raised areas. Before that, I was going into the recess areas as well, because if you kind of just paint the raised areas only, what happens is the contrast becomes too high. It looks a bit weird because you have these really dark recesses going all the way around, whereas really if it's pointing towards the light will go into those recesses. Now, so for the final highlight, I do pick out the strands a little bit, but don't worry about it too much. There you can see I've gone back with the red just to soften the pinkness a little bit. So we're making quite good progress on the model now. It's mainly just filling in a lot of the pieces. All the interesting parts are now painted. So, but moving on to the, I don't know what it's called, the loincloth thing. It's like this lizard skin. This is painted with Xereus purple. Now again, you have to think back. So it would have only just been slightly dusted this with the pale grey blue zenithal highlight on top of the black primer. So that was then given a coat of Volupus pink, I think it was, and that dries again. It's dried very dark, so it's dried a lot darker than if you did that layer over a very light background. It would look more pinky and vibrant, but because it's over a very dark base, it dries dark. That's how the contrast paint works. So it's allowed me to keep this quite dark looking purple color. Now, so I said it's being highlighted first with just plain Xereus purple straight, well, obviously from the pot, not mixed with any other colors, but a small amount of water to thin it down a little bit. I'm not going to paint every single one of those scales because I can't be bothered, and you don't really need to. If you just focus on the big ones and you just kind of pick out a few of the facets, and then leave the darker sides, but still pick out kind of the edges and other details. It does the job. It does all it needs to do, because really the zenithal with the contrast over the top, that has done a lot of the work for me here. So this is only a 5-10 minute job just to very quickly pick out these highlights. Don't take the final highlights too high. It looks fairly bright, so on the far left of the wet palette there, the lightest, the bottom of the three, that's obviously got the most white mixed in. Don't paint too much of that anywhere because it'll stand out too much, especially because this is a dark area. So even though it's not as light as the white dots on some of the other highlighted areas on the model, it will still stand out very brightly because the whole area is fairly dark here. And again, focus on the highlight placement, remember top left, and you won't go too far wrong with this. If it still looks a bit weird, like if you haven't put the matte varnish on at all up to this point, you will find that because of the Volupus contrast paint, the Volupus pink, that it still looks a bit shiny, and as you're applying this on, it's knocking back that shine in some of the highlight areas. But in the shadows, it'll still look a bit shiny. You will need to put a varnish of some sort on it. Now it could be a case of that you put a satin varnish over the top, and that'll just even everything out, and that'll be a little bit more hard wearing. I just much prefer a matte varnish. So, you know, as I said, just leave it till the end to make your life easier. But if you find that the shiny element of the contrast paints is putting you off and making it tricky for you to just work out in your head where the highlights look best, then just give it a quick spray of, I say, like if you've got an airbrush, give it a quick spray of the ultra matte. But if you don't have an airbrush, you can still just paint it on by hand. You know, it does cover really well by brush. You can see the final highlight kind of area here it's mainly on just these three big scales, and then the other ones have just got the odd touch here and there of highlight. The other nice thing is as well about that purple is it contrasts really nicely against the sort of orangey goldy bronze kind of colour of the little armour plates next to it. So now this is a completely optional stage, and I'm putting some verdigris weathering on the these bronze areas. I say it's optional because some people are going to find that after all that effort highlighting, doing the nice light next to dark areas, that they don't want to do this, which is perfectly fine as well. But I just thought it would be a bit more interesting to add a touch of colour, especially on the sword here, because the bronzy sections are quite close in colour now to the flat of the blade. And this will just help separate them out to be very clearly different materials. Like the texture's there, so they look different, but because the colour is so close, and having this on will again just push them further apart. And this is Sotek green. It's quite heavily watered down, around about 2 parts water to 1 part paint. You do want it quite watered down because really you want it to flow into the recesses. And when you're placing it as well, just kind of stick to the darker areas. Don't go much over the mid-tones. Definitely don't go over the highlights, because that kind of like it messes up the colour. It just kind of looks wrong. Remember that the bright highlight parts are where the light is catching it strongly, so it wouldn't work the same way. You actually dull down the highlights then. So just stay away from the bright highlights. Just stick to the darker areas and the recesses. And hopefully as you apply it as well, because it's watered down a bit, it will flow around in these recesses. Obviously there's 3 stages of blue, so it's Sotek green in the top right, then the next one's just added a bit of white, and then one on the far left, a bit more white. Fairly straightforward. You can see here I'm doing a stippling technique as well. If you're getting a reference for verdigris, it doesn't have a very specific texture. It can run a little bit. It's just sort of like a build-up of oxidization, and it can look a bit patchy. A lot of the time you get rubbed off parts as well, which can be quite nice. You get a shiny bit of metal showing through, and then around it the sort of more like as I'm doing painting the areas in the recesses and things, they tend to take more of the oxidization because it doesn't get rubbed off in those sections. but you can apply it quite sloppily as well. If you want, you could even just glaze it on and not do any of the texture work. It doesn't matter too much, but I thought this would help identify it as like an oxidization thing, the same way as I've done the rust on the blade. So it's basically just sort of bluey greeny rust as opposed to orangey rust. You will find that the lighter colours, so the ones where you've added the more of the white, those will make a stronger mark. Just be a little bit careful with those. If you do want to water them down to turn them into glazes, and because you found that some of the textured marks that you've put on there are a bit too strong, if you just glaze on, that will soften them down and kind of like blend them all together a little bit as well. You can see here how with the watered down effect it just runs into the crevices a bit. And it doesn't matter if it's not perfect, because again, remember, it's oxidization. It's not like it's supposed to be really neat or anything like that. Also remember, when you first apply it, it'll look like a stronger, lighter color, but as it dries, it'll become much more translucent. I'm also going to do the same thing to the skull on the claw. So you didn't see me paint that, but I just did it exactly the same way. Again, keeping it to the crevices, the recesses, things like that. You can see that I've used exactly the same colours on the little blue gems I mentioned on that spine section that's attached to the hair to the head. But anyway, now we're going back to the skin again. And you can see I've done exactly the same thing. I've got the Warboss green, and then I've added white 2 more times. So the Warboss green is right in the middle. To the left of that is Warboss green and white. Then above that is Warboss green and a lot of white. And but just bear in mind as well that Warboss green, because it's quite a translucent colour, even though the white is very strong on the top highlight, it's still going to be more sort of translucent than you might expect. So when you first apply it, just be prepared that it's not going to make a super strong mark, regardless of which highlight you're using. I've also got some German grey there, just in case I needed to shade it down a little bit. I ended up not really needing to use it, but you never know with these things. And also there's some pink horror here. I'm using that on his ears. I don't know if you can work it out looking at the video, but his ears are sort of shredded or something. I did have again a look at the box art to see what was going on there. And it looks like he's, being a beast boss, he's been getting into some scraps, and so he's hurt his ears, and he's also got a little scar on his, like next to his mouth in the middle. So I thought I'd just paint those as a pink horror colour. It contrasts nicely with the green. I haven't bothered to highlight them up very much. I'm just using the translucency of the paint like the green, so it's not going to be super opaque. It's very kind of subtly applied, but if you look closer, you'll see that it's sort of a pinky colour. Obviously, the more layers that you'll put on here, the more opaque it'll be, and it'll get stronger in colour. Again, it is one of those colours that seems to not be very opaque when you first apply it, so you do have to build it up if you want to get that strong colour in there. If you go too far, you find that you've just put too much on and it looks too strong. Don't worry too much, just go back with the greens and sort of blend it in at the edges a little bit. So now I'm just going to be spending a little bit of time painting on the green skin. I think I mentioned it earlier, but the face is the most important part of the model, so it's worth spending a bit of time doing it. And I will be painting in the extra detail. So I mentioned how, like, around the eyes, that should be the lightest point. You can see here where I'm putting on now, I'm going to be turning all these into sort of like extra, almost like scratches and things. And what it does is it makes the model look a lot more detailed to start with. But in general, all the texture work on the model makes it look more detailed. But because it's very densely packed detail, it makes the whole area look lighter. So it kind of re-emphasizes the fact the light's coming from the top left. You can see they're just painting on lines and things. They're very kind of subtly painted for a start. Then as I build up the layers, you can kind of pick out the ones that work better and just make it look all a bit neater. The one negative is because it's such light highlights, so you're working with a lot of white pigment. White pigment is horrible because it has larger particles in it, so it tends to give more of that. You can just sort of see it looking a bit more messy. It doesn't look as smooth. Like it should help with the green in there, the green pigment. So you got small particles with big ones, and it should sort of help it all blend together a bit. But just be aware that you do need to have the paint thin to keep it looking neat. The temptation is always to use thicker paint if you can't get a strong mark. The problem is, as soon as you use thicker paint, then the chances are that as it dries, it's going to leave a three-dimensional mark on the model. And you always see the thing on forums where people like thin your paints. It's not super helpful because you don't know how much to thin it, but basically if the paint doesn't flow as you're applying it, then it's too thick, regardless of what you're doing. But in terms of using a white paint, then you do generally have to thin it a little bit more than other colours, just to get that sort of smooth finish on there. Now, I'm using I'm still using the size 00 for the texture on this. You don't have to do that for most of the painting on here. Again, spend a bit more time on the head. It's worth it, rather than, you don't want to be bothering spending the same amount of time on things like the lower jaw on the claw, or bits like that. They're just not that important, but the head is like such a much more important area. So having these extra little fine details of things, just taking your time, does pay dividends at the end. And you can see here I'm going back using the Warboss green and just pushing that into some of the recesses, just to pull away actually some of the high contrast element, because, and again I mentioned this earlier, if it's facing the light source, the light will get into these recesses. Now obviously when you paint the contrast paint over the zenithal highlight, the paint runs into these recesses and it makes them darker, because when you first put the zenithal spray on there, the paint will also, because you're using it as a light source, will also go into these recesses and it should make them lighter. But when you put the contrast paint over the top, that naturally runs into the recesses and makes them darker again. So then what you do is you start painting up the highlight points on the model, which are just the raised lighter areas that you can see. And you tend to ignore the darker recesses, and if you do that, the highlight sections become too bright. Now to a certain extent you want to leave some, you want to be able to see the detail, you don't just want it as one flat colour, but you still want the recesses on the lightest part of the face to be much brighter than the recesses on the middle and the darker sides of the face. And what you'll actually see here is I highlight them up a bit for some of these marks on the face. Is I'll paint into the recesses, and then the next stage highlight I'll be picking out the details again, but then that will increase the contrast still, so that the raised areas look too bright. Then I'll go back and then I'll paint into the recesses again to raise it up a bit. It does become a case of moving backwards and forwards with the painting, kind of like to try and balance it all out so it all looks good. It is very much a case of looking at it and deciding, does it need to be lighter or does it need to be darker? And so there is always a chance that you're going to get it wrong and you have to you fix it. But because you're using thinner paints, it's actually quite easy to fix, just to very quickly go over an area just to make it lighter or darker. There you go, you can see I went over some of the details a little bit. Also not forgetting again that when it's a very thin paint and you paint it on, when you first apply it, it looks quite bright and strong, but as it dries it gets much duller and the paint underneath will show through more. The other thing is, because it's fairly watered down, it's around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. Is that it's very easy to flood an area because the paint becomes very wet. It flows very easily. So make sure you only use small amounts of paint on your brush. You can see there as I apply it, it sort of works like a heavy glaze. If you are very careful as you apply it, just using the tip, it will make a mark, like a definite mark, even though it's sort of subtle and translucent, but you can see clearly where the mark goes. But if there's a bit more paint on there, it will flood the area. Now you can do both, almost at the same time, and sort of push the pigment around a bit, and have control over it. This is kind of the painting style that I'm using here, as I said, so it's taking a bit longer painting the head, and it is something that you would probably do more for display level. I know it doesn't look display level at the moment when you look at the head, but remember, it is quite heavily zoomed in. When you look at it in your hand, it looks fairly reasonable. But this is kind of like the early stages, if you like, of display level. So if you wanted, you could just spend a lot of time making sure, using micro glazes, so very thin layers of paint, just with complete control, painting in all these details, just making them all perfectly blended. You could have something that looked very interesting. You could also add different hints of colour on here as well. So I've already got some pink in, but you could also add some bits of blue and things. You don't just have to stick to the green. Now again, I've been a little bit lazy in the fact that I've just highlighted it up from green. So there's pink in there, and there's some there's a little blue gem above it and things. But the actual colours on the orc skin are very basic that I've used. I'm just relying on the light volumes and the detail that I'm painting on to make it look interesting. Whereas if you wanted to take this to a higher level, you could have things like having his nose slightly tinted with different colours, all sorts of bits like that. You could have drool coming out, his teeth are more stained, but these are all things that you would probably do more for display level painting. So now I'm just very quickly going to paint in some of the eyeball. Unfortunately, my my memory card ran out just before the end, but I'll try and explain it to you as well. If you check out my Patreon or website, I'm creating a PDF for this as well, where I can try and explain it a bit more. But the eyeball, first of all, I gave it a coat of pale grey blue. Then I painted a black circle in. Now I'm using the same blues again as the verdigris and the blue gems. For a start off, using the Sotek green. It's called Sotek green, but it looks very blue. You paint a circle on top of the black, so there's a black circle, then you paint a blue Sotek green ring on there, where you leave a little black ring around the outside and a black circle in the middle. Don't worry too much about the black circle in the middle if you can't quite get it right. Because you can just go back with black and then neaten it up there anyway. Then using the two higher highlight colours, again, same that you've used for the verdigris and for the little gems on the head of the orc. You just paint the lower sections of the eye. So the first highlight, where it's just Sotek green and a small amount of white, you paint around about from halfway down, always painting towards the bottom. So from the left hand side towards the bottom, from the right hand side towards the bottom. Don't go paint from the left hand side all the way around the half circle up to the right hand side, because then the highest level of paint concentration will be on the right hand side. So, and then you do exactly the same thing with the next highlight, but you just take it a little bit further down, so it's more like just a third. So again, it's starting from the left to the bottom, then from the right to the bottom. Then you've got a nice quick transition there. And at this stage, it looks like an eye. It's really the light highlights at the end, and that's unfortunately the part that I managed to miss off the video. But just to describe how excuse me, how they're done, I just take the first highlight blue, and very quickly map out the highlight placement on there. So in the, again, top left, so remember that's where the light source is, so I want the light reflections on the eyeballs coming from the top left. I don't just do a dot. So most people when they paint eyes will do a dot. That's much better for, you know, if you're painting a Space Marine eye or whatever. An eye this big, you have to put in more detail with the reflections or it looks a bit weird. So if you see how I've done it, it's kind of like sort of squiggly shape that roughly follows the shape of the eye, and then a little dot in the corner. Also here you can see me using some of the pink horror, just painting these at the sides of the eyeball just to get in a little bit of colour in there. Now you can also paint in some red veins. I was going to, and then I couldn't be bothered, but I didn't think it mattered too much, but it just would add a little bit more detail as well. So there you can see again the highlights I was talking about, that, you know, first highlight and then go over it again with white, but just in a smaller section, and then put a little dot in as well. It works quite well. And the red is very simple. Evil Sunz Scarlet highlighted up with Trollslayer orange, and that's it pretty much. And there's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to subscribe, and I also have my website and Patreon where you can find other videos and PDFs. I'm now working on PDFs, just taking a little bit longer. But, you know, and I'm working on at the moment Balor. Hopefully I'll get another video for him out very soon. But again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.